Canada's nursing profession is being overhauled by identity politics as a new code of ethics forces nurses to adopt social justice and climate activism into their medical care.
Pierre Poilievre slams Crown prosecutors for demanding up to 8 years in prison for Freedom Convoy leaders, suggesting it's a glaring double standard in Canada's courts.
A new federal study confirms what Canadians have long suspected: mass immigration is driving up home and rent prices across the country. Hello, Canada. It's Wednesday, July 22nd, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Geoff Knight.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. The Canadian Nurses Association's 2025 Code of Ethics for Nurses denounces what it calls the, quote, white European-centric foundations of modern medicine and compels nurses to adopt a broad set of radical progressive political beliefs as part of their professional duties. Under the code, nurses must reflect on their, quote, professional power and privilege, and to structure their practice around anti-racism, allyship, and, quote, culturally safe care. Special attention must be given to equity-deserving groups, a category defined by race, gender identity, indigeneity, and other protected traits. Nurses are now required to acknowledge, quote, the historical and continuous impact that white European-centric models of nursing and health have on the perpetuation of anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, and other types of racism. The code also directs nurses to apply these concepts when assessing patient needs, communicating with colleagues, and participating in institutional policy. Under the social justice section, the code states that nurses must apply a planetary health lens to their care. The language goes further, instructing nurses to understand the, quote, interconnectedness between nature, for example, human beings, plants, animal species, and non-living entities, and to recognize the rights of nature and the planet. Climate disruption is linked to patient outcomes, and climate activism is framed as an ethical response to health inequality. Regulated Canadian nurses are now required to align their conduct with a detailed set of political values, among them social justice, gender ideology, Indigenous belief systems, and climate activism. The section on Indigenous health further requires nurses to integrate, quote, Indigenous ways of knowing into care delivery. These include ceremony, intergenerational trauma frameworks, and land-based teachings. Nurses are expected to understand the ongoing effects of colonization and adapt care to align with those narratives. Cultural safety in this model is defined by the client rather than the provider and determined through the lens of tribal identity. Even nurses who conscientiously object to certain procedures, including medical assistance in dying, abortion, gender-affirming interventions, or supervised drug use, must continue care until a substitute is found. The code further emphasizes that personal beliefs must not interfere with access to services and places responsibility on nurses to ensure continuity of care. So, Geoff, Canada is in desperate need of medical professionals, including nurses, as well as doctors, etc. And hypothetically, one could see a nurse who hopes to get into the field be potentially put off by the politicization of nurses' associations, like the Canadian Nurses Association's new code of ethics, because it's so fully imbued with the woke progressive ideology that has become prevalent across different professional organizations. So, Geoff, how might such a new code of ethics affect nurses or hopeful nurses who disagree with some of the political directives contained within?
Yeah, Cosman, nurses who disagree with the 2025 Code of Ethics political directives could face significant professional and personal challenges that may impact their ability to practice effectively. Those with differing views, particularly on issues like climate activism or gender ideology, might experience a sense of alienation or moral conflict, potentially leading to burnout or reluctance to engage fully in patient care as they navigate requirements that prioritize ideological alignment over individual conscience. This could prompt some to seek transfers to less ideologically demanding roles or even leave the profession altogether, exacerbating Canada's nursing shortage, already at 12% below target levels. Professionally, dissenters could encounter disciplinary actions if their reluctance to adopt these mandates is perceived as non-compliance, especially under the code's emphasis on finding substitutes for objected procedures like MAID or gender-affirming care, which might strain workplace dynamics and resource allocation. The lack of clear guidance on balancing equality and equity could leave nurses vulnerable to accusations of bias, creating a climate of uncertainty where they might self-censor to avoid scrutiny from regulators or peers. Additionally, the integration of indigenous frameworks or planetary health lenses might alienate nurses from diverse cultural or scientific backgrounds, risking legal challenges or union grievances if they feel forced to adopt beliefs conflicting with their own. And this could potentially lead to a fragmented workforce which is less able to deliver cohesive care. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre criticized Canada's justice system over the potential 7- and 8-year prison sentences sought by Crown prosecutors for Freedom Convoy leaders Tamara Lich and Chris Barber. In a post to X on Monday, Poilievre criticized Canadian courts for what he viewed as a blatant double standard, where violent criminals and extremists are let off easy, while peaceful demonstrators like Lich and Barber face years in prison. Poilievre wrote, quote, "Let's get this straight. While rampant violent offenders are released hours after their most recent charges, and anti-Semitic rioters vandalize businesses, terrorize daycares, and block traffic without consequences, the Crown wants 7 years prison time for the charge of mischief for Lich and Barber. How is this justice?" Poilievre's comments follow a post by Lich, who revealed on X that Crown prosecutors are seeking 7-year sentences for her on a charge of mischief, and an 8-year sentence for Barber on mischief and a charge of counseling others to disobey an order. Earlier this year, an Ontario court found Lich and Barber not guilty of most of the charges filed against them. An Ontario Superior Court judge struck down 4 charges related to obstruction of police and intimidation for both protest leaders. The Crown's demands stand in stark contrast to the lenient treatment often given by courts to repeat offenders for violent and horrific crimes. For his own part, Poilievre had, like the Freedom Convoy protesters themselves, previously criticized COVID pandemic mandates and government overreach. The Freedom Convoy, which began as a protest against federal COVID-19 vaccine mandates, sparked a national movement and led to the historic and unconstitutional invocation of the Emergencies Act by the Trudeau Liberal government. Considered by some observers the longest mischief trial in history, the prolonged proceedings against Lich and Barber have drawn criticism for their cost, with estimates suggesting the trial has cost taxpayers several $million in legal and court resources. So, Cosmin, what does the Crown's pursuit of harsh sentences for Lich and Barber say about the politicization of Canada's justice system?
Well, it says that courts are becoming more selective about the concept of equal justice in Canada. I mean, it does raise the question, do we even have equal justice in this country when you see violent criminals, gang members, even sex offenders getting out on bail, house arrest, or just walking free? We've seen this with stories just in the last month, and I'd welcome you to go to Juno News just to check out some of the crime reporting we've done, because it's outrageous what kind of sentences or what are being passed off as just sentences for some heinous crimes. Meanwhile, the government wants to throw peaceful protesters like Tamara Lich and Chris Barber in jail for 7 or 8 years over mischief charges. And as the article points out, a reminder to everybody is that most of the charges they were facing related to the Freedom Convoy were actually dropped. It's just 2 remaining ones that they have to essentially get a sentence on. So just look at what's been happening recently in Montreal. There was a convicted killer with a high chance of reoffending, was paroled, and then he's now accused of murdering again. We saw just in Toronto now that a 14-year-old stabbed a grandmother who died from her injuries in a parking lot. And there's reports that he did it while he was out on bail. But Lich and Barber, 2 peaceful protesters, the Crown wants to lock them up for nearly a decade. as if this trial hasn't already dragged on enough. And I think Poilievre nailed a certain aspect of this when he tweeted, violent offenders walking free and the crown wants 7 years for mischief. How is that justice? Because it's not justice. It's politics. And this entire trial has been driven by a certain push from the government and crown prosecutors because they know that the invocation of the Emergencies Act was not constitutional. It was not a proportional response to what was going on. And the whole point of this was to make an example out of individuals who stood up to government overreach and, quite frankly, draconian policies that were implemented during COVID-19. A new federal study has found that mass migration is raising Canada's housing and rent prices, with researchers linking population inflows to more than a fifth of price increases in some cities. Researchers found a clear pattern. Quote, municipalities experiencing larger increases in house values also saw a more rapid increase in new immigrant populations. In larger urban centers with populations exceeding 100,000 people, that collectively attracted more than 80% of new immigrants, the impact was even harder. Quote, in 53 municipalities with a population exceeding 100,000, the rise in new immigrants accounted for 21% of the overall increase in median house values and 13% of the increase in median rents, the report found. Nationwide, the influx of newcomers within a 5-year period was associated with, quote, 11% of the rise in both median house values for owner-occupied properties and median monthly rental rates. The Bank of Canada has previously issued warnings on the negative effects of mass migration. In its monetary policy report published in July 2024, it said immigration had created, quote, inflationary pressures in the housing market. The Bank of Canada also published a report in May of this year warning that Canada's economy has become increasingly reliant on low-wage mass migration of temporary workers from India and the Middle East. Despite the mounting data, left-leaning politicians have rejected the clear connection between immigration and housing affordability. New Democrat MP Jenny Kwan accused immigration skeptics and the government of promoting a, quote, racist attitude towards migrants. Quote, all of a sudden, the government decides that because of the housing crisis, the most convenient thing for them to do is blame the newcomers, Kwan told reporters on June 5th. The Department of Immigration report titled Immigration and Housing Prices Across Municipalities in Canada analyzed 15 years of municipal data and concluded that new immigrants accounted for between 11% and 21% of the increase in housing prices and rents nationwide. Geoff, when we have data that's this clear put out by the federal government itself, will this force Ottawa to admit that mass migration has hurt Canadians' ability to afford homes and potentially jeopardized the ability of future generations to have their own place?
Yeah, Cosmin, the likelihood of Ottawa actually admitting that mass migration is hurting Canadians' ability to afford homes, despite the new federal study released today, remains low in the near future due to entrenched political dynamics surrounding the mass migration issue. The government's current minority status relies on NDP support, where figures like Jerry Kwan have framed immigration critiques as discriminatory, making any admission politically costly. Historical trends show a reluctance to pivot, with past economic warnings sidelined in favor of growth-focused narratives, especially as trade negotiations with the U.S. loom large, demanding a unified front. Public sentiment, while increasingly frustrated, lacks the critical mass that's needed. Recent protests have been localized, not nationwide, leaving policymakers insulated unless a major electoral threat emerges, such as a conservative surge tied to housing issues. Without a catalyst like a coalition collapse or a dramatic policy shift from key allies, Ottawa is likely to deflect rather than confront the issue head-on.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.